So I've made this cake once before, and that was my first time trying to make a buttercream, and let me just say it didn't go very well. I didn't realize all the ingredients needed to be the same temperature in order to come together into a smooth buttercream. So I'm gonna redeem myself today and actually properly make this cake. And I've been thinking about this cake for a while now, and I've just really been craving it. So today is the day that I'm going to make this mocha cake. So a mocha cake consists of two things. You need a chocolate sponge cake and then a coffee buttercream. So for the actual sponge cake, you're going to need 4 room temperature eggs, 125 grams of sugar, a good pinch of salt, 100 grams of flour, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, 25 grams each of cocoa powder, and cornstarch. So I've showed you in a couple of videos already how to make a sponge cake, and the principle is usually always the same. But if you want a little bit more detail of how to make a sponge cake, you can watch my Black Forest cake. And I explain in a lot of easy, simple steps how to make a sponge cake and how to make it turn out good. So basically all I'm going to do for the sponge cake is crack my eggs into my KitchenAid with the sugar and the salt, and let that whisk for about 10-ish minutes or until it's tripled in size and you can't feel any sugar grains in between your finger. And while that's being mixed up, I'm going to sift together all of my dry ingredients. Now there's 2 ways to make a sponge cake. There's the traditional way where you separate your eggs and whisk up the egg yolks with part of the sugar and the egg whites with the other part of the sugar, and then fold them together before folding in the dry ingredients. But you can just as easily just crack your whole egg into your mixer and just let that whisk up for 10-12 minutes until it's tripled in size. It gives you pretty much the same results, and it just saves you like a whole step and a lot of dishes. So that's what I'm going to do today. That being said, I'm going to preheat my oven to 180 degrees Celsius or 360 degrees Fahrenheit. Just a side note, I use convection, so I'm actually going to be using 335 degrees Fahrenheit with convection. But just do whatever your oven does and what you feel comfortable doing. Alright, enough chit chat. Let's get the eggs whisking up and get this cake ready and in the oven. Alright, so the eggs have tripled in size and it's super fluffy. So this is exactly what we want. I'm just going to carefully try to remove as much as possible from the attachment here before I really gently fold in all of my dry ingredients. Now I've also decided to double sieve the dry ingredients. So I've already sieved them all together and given them a good mix. But before I fold them in, I'm going to sieve them into the bowl one more time. I've also got my handy dandy spatula. So I'm going to do this in maybe 2 or 3 batches. So I'm not going to add all the dry ingredients all at the same time. Maybe like 2 spoons first. Now I'm just going to gently fold. And you want to try and keep as much air as you humanly possibly can. And once this is about 80 or 70% incorporated, I'm going to add the rest of the dry ingredients. just going to transfer this into my pre-lined baking tin. So as you can see, I just lined the bottom part. I don't worry about the edges. And then this is just going to bake for 30 to 40 minutes. The cake is all done baking, so we just have to let it cool off before we finish filling the cake and decorating the cake. Now, as we all know by now, I'm very impatient, so I'm actually just going to put this cake in the garage, so it'll probably be cooled down in like an hour, hour and a half, so I can still finish the cake before I go to work, which is ideal. If it's not very cold where you are, or you don't have the luxury of fitting this into your fridge or into your cold garage, you can always just let the cake cool off overnight and then finish decorating the cake the next day. Now, I've already made my German buttercream, which is right here. If you don't know how to make it, you can watch it in this video. So to make the Mocha Buttercream, I'm going to be adding 1 teaspoon of cocoa powder, 2 teaspoons of instant coffee, and then about a shot of espresso. So to make the actual buttercream, I'm basically just going to dissolve the cocoa powder and the instant coffee inside of the espresso, and then I'm going to temper it. So I'm basically going to slowly add some buttercream to this to make sure it kind of gets the same temperature before adding it all into here. Now, the buttercream might separate a little bit, so it'll look kind of grainy, but that's just because of the temperature difference, which is why we're adding the buttercream slowly. Once it's starting to come together a little bit, I'm going to transfer all of this into the KitchenAid and just let that mix until it's nice and combined. Now also make sure to scrape down the edges every now and then so that it's not going to be marbled. Now, as you can see, this buttercream has come together really nicely and it's all one color and it's super fluffy. This is how you want it. So what can happen with buttercream is if the temperatures of the ingredients aren't the same, it can kind of start to separate. But don't worry, you can always save it. You can either melt down a little bit of the buttercream, like 2 tablespoons maybe, and then add it back to your mixture if the mixture is too cold. Or if your mixture is too runny, you can just put it in the fridge for a couple of minutes until it thickens up and then give it another whisk. So I'm going to give it one tiny try to see if I need to add any more coffee. I've just dissolved another teaspoon of my instant coffee in a tiny bit of warm water, just because I want a tiny bit of a more rich coffee flavor. So I'm just going to add that in, and then I think the buttercream is all done. The buttercream is all done, so I'm just going to put this to the side for now while I prepare the actual cake. So the actual sponge cake is pretty much cooled off, and I've already removed it from the tin. All I'm going to do now is cut it into 3 even layers. If you want to see how I do this in a little more detail, to see how I do it more or less evenly, you can watch this video. Other than that, I'm just going to cut these. Now we're ready to layer the cake. So personally, I like to use the top part of the cake as the bottom layer and then the bottom layer of the cake as the top part. That just allows me to get a really flat surface that isn't going to be lopsided without using too much buttercream. I'm also going to be using this fancy handy dandy turntable because it just allows me to get a smoother edge. I also always like to smear a tiny bit of my cream at the bottom of whatever surface I'm going to be plating on. That way the cake has a better chance of sticking to it. At this point, you can also drench your cake in some coffee or coffee liqueur or some simple syrup. I usually don't do that because I think the cake gets too soggy, but whatever floats your boat. So I'm just gonna add about a third, just over a third of the cream to this layer and smooth it out. Now I'm going to add the middle layer right on top, try to line it up, and just slightly press down. And I'm just going to repeat for the next third of the cream. Now for the last layer, I'm actually just going to flip it around so that the bottom part of the cake is right on top. Now I'm just going to use the rest of my buttercream to cover the top as well as the sides. Now I'm not going to worry too much about the sides looking perfect because I'm going to cover them with grated chocolate anyways. As long as everything is covered, that's all that matters. I'm going to let this chill for at least half an hour for the buttercream to get nice and thick and cold again. And at that point, I'm going to finish decorating. The cake is chilled for like 30-40 minutes and the buttercream is not sticky to the touch. That's when you know it's ready. So I've got a tiny bit of buttercream left, which I'm going to use to make kind of a final coat and cover the crumb coat. Now for the decoration, I'm going to be using this grated chocolate and press it along the side, kind of like a Black Forest cake. If you don't have chocolate that looks like this, you can also just use chocolate sprinkles like these ones, or you can make a ganache and have it drip down the sides. It's totally up to you. Now I'm just going to use this plastic looking thing to scoop up the chocolate and then slide it along the side. I'm just going to transfer this onto my nicer serving plate. Now for the last couple of details, I've whipped up some whipping cream with just a regular piping tip. And I've also got some chocolate coffee beans here, which I'm going to use for the final decorations.